All right, students, welcome back to Unit 3. Today we are going to be continuing on with Lesson 3.7, where we'll talk about writing dialogue. And we're just going to get into the basics of writing dialogue. So our goals today, our I can statement says, I can use dialogue in my writing. And our essential question says, how do I use dialogue in my writing? So your directions for this lesson. On your paper, take notes. Write everything highlighted into the correct section of your notes paper. Pause the video on each slide with notes and then write them down. Let's start basic. What is dialogue? Dialogue is a conversation between two or more characters. In our case, dialogue is going to be something that we're writing for our personal narrative. Why do writers use dialogue? And there's several reasons. Please take all of them. The first is to help tell the story. Next is to show character reactions. It's also used to explain the thoughts of a character, to add detail, to help characterization or fleshing out the characters, giving character traits, and to show interaction between characters in your story. So part 3 is going to be the parts of dialogue. So we have right here the example, will we get ice cream? Asked Greg. There's two main parts of dialogue. The first part is what the character says. Will we get ice cream? The second is who said it, sometimes called the dialogue tag. Asked Greg. So the two parts go together, what the character says and who says it. This is always going to be the case. Sometimes it'll be in a different order. Let's continue. The part the character says must start and end with quotation marks. Will we get ice cream? Asked Greg. Note the two marks right here and here. Those are called quotation marks, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, but they're easy to go unnoticed because we see them so often in the stories we read. Make sure that you mark what the character says with those marks. Those who read frequently will note how important dialogue is to organization. Without it, things quickly get pretty messy. Let's look at an example. So up here at the top, we have an example of basically no quotation marks, no organization, and different characters speaking. It says, what's for dinner? I'm making chili. I don't like chili. That's too bad. You will eat what you are served. What's all this commotion in here? I was trying to take a nap. Woof. Now, clearly, we can kind of get an idea of what's going on there, but it's a mess. Imagine reading a whole book with sections like this. It would be a nightmare. Instead, what we have in most of what we read, the stories that we read, we have things spread up into paragraphs for each of the different parts of dialogue, and we have those dialogue tags to show us who is speaking. So this would probably make more sense. It starts, what's for dinner? Asked Daniel. I'm making chili, replied Greta. Daniel scowled. I don't like chili. That's too bad. You will eat what I cook, she yelled back. Grandpa appeared in the door, his eyes bleary. What's all this commotion in here? I was trying to take a nap. Woof, exclaimed Sparky the dog, confused at all the noise. In this example, it makes a whole lot more sense what's going on. It's not really perfect. You can see it's kind of mechanical in how it goes about, but it serves to illustrate how when we break things up with dialogue and those dialogue tags, we can actually tell who's speaking and what's going on. So number 4 is going to be our beginning rules for dialogue. Rule number 1 says, use quotation marks to show who is speaking. And we have our example down here. What's for dinner? Asked Daniel. Rule number 2 is going to be always create a new paragraph for new speakers. So an incorrect example would be, this is my favorite hat, said Craig. It looks terrible on you, said Chris. Correct example splits those up into two separate statements so that you can actually follow it a little bit better. Rule number 3. The first letter of the first word is always capitalized. "What's for dinner?" asked Daniel. Rule 4. Punctuate correctly. This is probably the most complicated rule, and this is something that you'll have to practice. You'll notice here with these lines the different ways that these parts of dialogue are going to be punctuated. So when you ask a question, you'd use a question mark before the end of the quote. When you're just going along with a regular sentence, you're going to use a comma to break it up before the quotation. And then if you have a quotation by itself, which can happen, then you put a period at the end of it, or whatever type of punctuation that it calls for. In our next section, tips, we'll mention a couple things that could kind of help you out if you get stuck with that last one and putting the punctuation in. So our first tip is, if you get stuck, open a book you're reading and look at the dialogue within. Look at how actual writers write dialogue. If you have access to a computer in front of you, try to look up some examples there, or type in the different rules of dialogue. Type in rules of dialogue on Google, look it up, and you'll get big lists that can have tons of examples and show you what you need to do. As time goes on and you practice more and more, you'll need those less. But if you get stuck, go for help. Number 2, go back and read what you wrote. A lot of the times, if you go back and read anything that you write, it will help you edit it. This is especially true for dialogue. Does it flow? Does it flow like it does when you read a book or someone else's story? And tip number 3 is, don't use meaningless dialogue. Don't add dialogue just to add it. Make sure that it serves a purpose. It's good for probably just about any personal narrative to have dialogue in it, but it doesn't always have to be completely, full of it the entire time. Dialogue has to serve a purpose, or else it's just there, and in fact can even make the story more boring. Remember on one of those early slides when we talked about how it needed to have some kind of purpose, like adding character traits or showing a character's reaction or helping the story move forward. Make sure that it does one of those. Dialogue is arguably one of the more difficult parts of writing to get down and get correct. So don't stress if yours isn't perfect, and don't add more than you have to. Okay, so that is going to conclude our brief lesson on dialogue for lesson 3.7. Let's end with a review question. It says, why should I use dialogue in my writing? And try to get that down before anything else.